Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on cultural humility. I'm going to give everyone a second to join, but while everyone is joining, please feel free to tell us where you're joining from in the chat. I'm going to start here in just a second with some housekeeping items, and then I will turn it over to our presenters. My name is Andrea Bergoa. I am the Higher Education Marketing Manager here at APA Publishing, and we are so happy to have you here with us today. Number one, I just want to let everyone know that all of our attendees have their cameras turned off and you are muted, but you can interact in the chat. Please feel free to talk to your fellow attendees in the chat box. And if you have any questions for our panel, please use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. That way we can keep track of any questions that you may have. Second, we will be providing a recording of this session. Please look for an email within a day and then an additional email with additional resources a week or two from now. But you will be getting a copy of this recording that also has the chat available. So if you miss anything in chat, don't worry. It will be there. As recognition for your attendance today, you will be receiving an attendance certificate and a badge that you can download and share on social media as a thank you for being here. So again, I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on teaching cultural humility. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we will be off to the races. So first, Joshua Hook is a professor and director of clinical training for the Counseling and Psychology PhD program at the University of North Texas. His research focuses on humility, religion and spirituality, and multicultural counseling. Donnie Davis is a professor and program coordinator for the Counseling Psychology PhD program at Georgia State University. He is also in the clinical mental health and counselor education and practice programs. His research focuses on humility, forgiveness, gratitude, and other relational virtues. Jesse Owen is a professor and associate dean for research for Morgridge College of Education at the University of Denver. His research focuses primarily on psychotherapy research, including a key focus on multicultural orientation. Martin Kivligan is professor of counseling psychology and chair of the Department of Psychological and Quantitative Foundations at the University of Iowa. His research primarily focuses on psychotherapy process and outcome with an emphasis on group psychotherapy training and practice. And finally, Karen W. Tao is an associate professor and director of clinical training for the Counseling Psychology PhD program at the University of Utah. She is perennially curious about the questions, does multicultural orientation matter and how do we know? And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Joshua Hook. Please take it away.
All right, thank you, Andrea, and great to be with y'all. As a way of, before we get started, as a way of a kind of an extended introduction, I thought the panelists could share a little bit about the contexts in which they've been working and teaching cultural humility and multicultural orientation. So I'll go ahead and start. Again, I'm in a counseling psychology PhD program, and I've taught the multicultural counseling graduate seminar for several years. And then currently I teach kind of a class for first year PhD students where we go over things like theories and beginning counseling skills. And I also integrate cultural humility into that course. So Donnie, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks, Josh. So yeah, the courses that I've integrated this into, we have a first year counseling psych course where people do helping skills and theories as well, and we're trying to get them ready for their first practicum. And then I also have a course on leadership in positive psychology, and we're really trying to do a range of things that would help people during the early career phase and kind of integrating positive psychology with a commitment to social justice. So thank you. I'll popcorn Jesse.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for spending some time. I've taught MCO as a standalone course. I've also infused it in other courses that I teach in the master's and doctoral program here at the Counseling Psych program at University of Denver. And I also do a fair bit of talks that kind of specialize it to particular clinics, particular departments, particular organizations. And so that has also kind of rounded out my experience. Karen.
Hi, everyone. Let's see. In addition to teaching in graduate level courses, I have introduced the framework of multicultural orientation and cultural humility in healthcare settings, worked in nonprofits and healthcare settings with medical students, and even at a hotel, the Hyatt Regency. I introduced the MCO framework, and it was really fun.
How about you, Martin?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, thanks, Karen, for popcorning to me. Appreciate it. Just kidding. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. So similarly at the graduate level, I incorporate MCO, cultural humility, within our advanced group leadership class. And so that's all around facilitating therapy groups. We also have a growing undergraduate major in counseling and behavioral health services, and it's been really exciting and fun to infuse MCO and cultural humility in a health psychology course that I teach, and then also an introduction to counseling psychology undergraduate course as well.
All right, thank you. And throughout this the webinar today, you'll hear from each of us on infusing culture, humility, and multicultural orientation in some of our different areas of work. And so to kick things off, we thought that it might be interesting for me to share a little bit about how some of our research on cultural humility got started. And then Jesse's going to share a little bit about how some of his work on multicultural orientation got started. And so real briefly, cultural humility isn't a new thing that we came up with. It had been around in the literature, mostly in kind of the areas of healthcare and client care in that area, but not a lot on using that construct in psychology, and not a lot of empirical work. So we had been doing some empirical work on humility at the time, and thinking about, what are some areas where humility is difficult to practice and might be especially important to look at humility in those contexts. And cultural differences seemed like one of those areas where it's really challenging to engage with people who are different from you in a respectful way. And so we thought that humility might be an important piece of the puzzle in that issue and problem. At that time, I was also started sort of beginning my faculty job and was teaching multicultural counseling for graduate students. And my initial experience, one of the things I was noticing was that there was a lot of pressure from students to, get it right and, appear competent, worry and anxiety about making mistakes. And I was thinking that humility might be a really good framework for how to organize multicultural training, particularly with its focus on being aware of and acknowledging your limitations, and normalizing some of that in your growth as a clinician, as well as seeing growth in multicultural counseling and diversity issues as a lifelong process, not something that you kind of get to a certain point and you're done, but something that ideally you'd be working on your entire career. So that's how that got started. Jesse, you want to share a little bit about how the MCO got started?
Yeah, so we started MCO back when Karen and I were on internship at UC Davis, and I see Emil's in the audience. Nice call out for Emil Rodolfo, was our director back in the day. And so we really wanted to kind of transition the conversation from competencies to what is it that we're actually looking for in the room, the therapy room, supervision space as it's expanded. And that's really kind of been our focus, about having a lens in which people can see the world, more of a way of being, and how you are and how you show up in that space was really kind of some of our guiding forces originally. And as it's morphed over time, we see kind of a development into groups, into couples, supervision, to organizations. And so it's a really interesting development. But for us, the heart of it was really to help people understand that culture is important no matter who's sitting in front of you, and how you understand the systems that people live in is very important, and that the motivation in which and how people learn culture, humility, and kind of embrace it is really challenging, much more challenging than it appears originally. And to do that on a continual basis, it can be tiring, can be challenging, but rewarding all the same. So that's kind of where we started at.
Thanks, Jesse. So now in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Cultural Humility book that we have. And it just recently came out this summer, the second edition, and I'll hold it up just in case people are curious to see what it looks like. And I want to talk a little bit about how the book is organized and maybe what's new in the second edition. And in case when you think about your instruction of multicultural topics or cultural humility, if it might be something, a resource that might be helpful for you. So how the book is organized is it's organized into two main parts. So the first part has to do with theoretical foundation and self-awareness. And so we start by kind of walking the reader through what cultural humility is and what the multicultural oriented model is and what it comprises. And a little bit of the history about how it relates to multicultural competence as well. And then we kind of shift gears a little bit into talking about self-awareness and encouraging the reader and walking them through some exercises to kind of understand themselves in a deeper way culturally, and not just their cultural identities per se, but how those cultural identities interact with one another and how they interact with experiences of power, privilege, and marginalization as well. Also in that first part of the book, we have a chapter on kind of some processes. There's some growth processes to work through to reduce cultural biases when they come into your awareness, and then also to work towards social justice in the contexts that you are a part of. So the first part of the book, a little bit more theoretical, a little bit more internal work. And then the second part of the book really focuses on what cultural humility and the multicultural orientation looks like when in clinical practice, so kind of in the therapy room. And the first chapter of that section is a little bit broader, sort of looking at cultural humility and MCO integrated into the different aspects of psychotherapy. And then as we get on in that second part of the book, we kind of do a deep dive into some of the key processes of psychotherapy. So thinking about how cultural humility and MCO show up in developing a working alliance with your client. We talk about navigating value differences, cultural value differences when they come up in therapy, because we know that's kind of a common situation that students struggle with quite a bit. We also talk about repairing the therapeutic relationship after cultural ruptures. So we talk about, what to do if maybe you've committed a rupture or microaggression with a client. We also talk about situations where the client might have committed a microaggression toward you as the therapist, and some things to think about in those types of situations. And then as we go on in the book, we talk about, we kind of conclude by talking about working within your limits as a therapist, and then we wrap it up with a conclusion chapter. So that's just a kind of a bird's eye view of what the book is about. In terms of what's new in the second edition, it's been 8 years since we wrote the first edition of the book. A lot's changed in the world, lots happened. I think I still feel that cultural humility and the multicultural orientation model are very timely, both in our therapy rooms and in the world today. It is, I don't know if it's more challenging than ever, but it seems very challenging to form and then maintain good, respectful relationships with people who disagree with us and who are culturally different at times. And so that's a challenge that we believe that cultural humility in the MCO model may have something to say and may be helpful in that regard. In this second edition, there's been a lot of updated theory and research that we've implemented into the book. We also tried to work hard in this edition to provide additional nuance for how cultural humility and the multicultural orientation model might be contextualized, given the various cultural identities of the therapist. So how it might look different, or some different things to think about if the therapist is a member of a marginalized identity, for example. Increased our focus throughout the book on systemic and structural issues. So we tried to give that quite a bit of room and discussion. We have updated exercises throughout the book and updated examples And so some of that's based on just our experience, giving talks and teaching over the years, and then also some of the feedback we received from readers and colleagues over the years. And then the to mention is something that's new in the second edition is we have quite a bit of ancillary materials for instructors. So, example syllabi, PowerPoint slides, assignments, activities, a lot of different things like that. So if you're using the book to teach your class, there's a lot of supplemental materials too that you can use if it's helpful for you. So again, encourage you to check it out if you're interested and you think it would be helpful for you in your work at your university or college. So I'll take a pause and I think I'm putting it over to Jesse, who's going to talk next.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That's a great overview. One of the things I want to just kind of drill down a little bit more on that you mentioned is that we did think more critically about what do these concepts mean for marginalized therapists, for marginalized supervisors who are in this space, and the challenges that go into being somebody from a marginalized background. Myself as a biracial man, like I've faced some really interesting power dynamics, social power dynamics, as well as therapeutic or supervisory power dynamics. And we wanted to name that a little bit more explicitly. And I think we did a decent job of this. Just for context, when we published the 2017 version, that was basically done in 2016 when we had about 3 years-ish of research in the psychotherapy space. And now we have close to 8 to 9 plus, maybe 10 plus years of research that we have to draw from. And so I think a lot of the examples are more contextualized and richer in that way. I think the other things that we tried to do is understand different roles. So we do have examples in there, not just of psychotherapy, but of supervision sessions and how that might look. So I think it can be applicable in a lot of different areas, not just classes, but maybe like internships or postdoc programs where that might be more applicable in those areas, even just by learning to be a supervisor. I think some of those examples can be helpful for super soup, for instance, in those pieces. Just one last thing, part of the pieces that I put in there on the multiculturalorientation.com website is that we do have a section on that page that's podcasts. And these are podcasts generated about articles. So you can have the articles there, but you can also listen to AI generated podcasts, which is actually kind of interesting because they're pretty decently accurate and pretty engaging. And so I've been using some podcasts in my classes as an alternative form of media. So I still give the article for them to read, but also say, hey, here's another way of consuming this information. And a lot of my students really like the podcast. They're like, I can listen to it while I'm driving into school. I can listen to it while I'm working out. So different way of consuming information, but just to kind of think about this, how people learn, just kind of the epistemological understandings of those kind of ways of being in that space. So a lot of cool things in the book. It's not perfect. I think that's the thing that we've learned, and the hard thing about books like this, that we can't cover everything. And that's partly why we wanted to bring Martin and Karen beyond their expertise in MCO, but like they really do cover a lot of different areas in their own work that we weren't able to cover fully in this book just because of time and space. So we do recognize that, but we also hope that it generates new ideas, new thinking, and new thoughts about how to understand the clinical space, supervision space, classroom space. So I'll hand it back over to Donnie.
Thanks, Jesse. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about was some interesting directions of applying MCO from a positive psychology or strength-focused perspective. And my main goal is just to get people interested. And if you want to learn more, I would hope that you would reach out to me and other people. And with that in mind, I wanted to reiterate. So we have several authors on the book, but Jesse included the Multicultural Orientation website. One of the things that I really like about our growing network of people is a lot of us really have kind of grown up professionally together, and we've developed strong friendships with each other. And so some of the people that I really look up to and admire are the people I get to work with. So one of our authors, Curleen DeBlair, is not here, but she was, I helped with the second part of the book, and it would not have been very good without her help. So, I just want to express my appreciation to Karen and Martin and kind of all of the other people that are involved in this network. If you go to the page, there's 25 people who are kind of investing in scholarship and research and kind of integrating this into training. So I'm kind of giving one example of how I'm trying to extend this work in the area of positive psychology. So what we've been doing, and there's probably now about 8 or 10 people who are looking at this, that we got a small course grant from Yale University, and it was actually out of the humanities, a scholar named Marissa Wolf. We basically got a small teaching grant to go to Iceland and learn about people who were really giving humanities critiques of positive psychology. And so what I realized is some of the themes that they were addressing, kind of critiquing positive psychology, really fit well with the multicultural orientation framework. And so some of the questions that we had kind of been talking about how to integrate this into practice and really to have a strength-focused approach to integrating MCO, this group kind of helped us start to think about. So to kind of give you a sense of what we're trying to do, in our first round, we adapted a positive psych course to undergrad, and we used kind of counseling psychology themes and MCO ideas, and we applied it to a way of teaching an undergrad course. And if we have a brief article if you wanted to kind of learn more about that. But this May, we're actually doing a retreat-based course where people will go to Callaway Gardens. It's a really nice place about an hour from Atlanta, Georgia. And we're going to focus on the common problem of burnout prevention and kind of from a strength-oriented perspective. So we'll start with the critiques of like the wellness industry and kind of all that's come around that. There's a lot of money to be made and kind of in terms of doing wellness initiatives, and even insurance companies are kind of getting in on that business. So there's a lot to critique culturally, but then we talk about what do we actually know about burnout prevention? How do you kind of leverage some of the critiques that have come about and have a deeper understanding of how to prevent burnout? How do you have a perspective that might generalize across different cultural groups? And then we focus on 3 practical areas. So we focus on how do you grow in your self-awareness? How do you grow more interpersonally mature? So if you think of kind of developing socio-emotional skills across your professional life, what would it look like to kind of keep growing? And then the last part is about how do you grow in your sense of kind of existential groundedness? How do you have a sense of being inspired and clarifying what matters most to you? So it's been very generative, and I think the one theme that I would just want to kind of end with is the work that we do. We need to find ways of training that will sustain us over longer periods of time. And so what I've started to really be inspired as I kind of went through, I'm a professor, and I used to do research. And I would fit my question to what the methods could do. But as I've gotten past, the requirements, I'm now like wanting to say, what do we really know would work? I trained as a college athlete, and there's a lot that I think I know about training, what works and doesn't work, that we really haven't integrated into our training processes yet. And so I've really enjoyed kind of getting into teams of people where people have different ways of thinking about it, and it can kind of check my assumptions. So if any of y'all are interested in kind of that, mission to help improve the quality of training and have less of our people be burned out kind of early career, I think you'll find that the scholars in the MCO network are a really good partnership, because that really is the spirit. Many of us kind of came into this work when we were kind of starting out, and we've really supported each other. And I think there's a spirit of kind of offering that support to anyone who gets interested in this work. So I'll kind of stop there. I wanted to kind of set up Martin. So he, in our group, he's the one who really extended MCO work into group psychotherapy. So when we first started out, there was the initial research that was happening was on one-on-one counseling. And so he's the one who kind of brought things into that area. So I'll pass things to you, Martin.
Sure, thanks. Well, I'm excited to be here to talk about the application at MCO to group. And I will just start with saying all of the research that I've done with colleagues and with students have really built upon the foundation that Karen and Jesse and Josh, Don have all created. And so this really is not creating something new, but applying it to group therapy. One of the things that we've learned and we've struggled with is how complex trying to apply this to small groups really is. It's been a challenge, but it's also been incredibly exciting to try to do. And one of the things that we've really come to understand, and we're still grappling with more and more, is that cultural humility within a group setting operates at so many various levels. We're no longer now just within this dyadic space, focusing largely on the therapist or the group leader. That's, of course, hugely important, right? Within group therapy. But we're also finding out that the group members own cultural humility, as well as this collective sense of cultural humility within the group as a whole is equally important. So for example, one of my students did a study that looked at not only the group leader's cultural humility, but the other members' cultural humility. And what he really stumbled upon and found is that group members reported the highest level of benefit from these groups, where both the leader and the group members were perceived to be high on cultural humility, right? And so this really kind of caused us to step back and realize, okay, we've got to look beyond the leader. We've got to understand what's going on, across all these levels. And the thing that, we don't really have answers for yet, but what we're really trying to understand more deeply is the training of therapists in, building this orientation or being able to really embody this orientation. And what's tricky for groups is within our training, and particularly we do experiential training groups within our advanced group leadership class, similar to counselor ed programs or KCREP accredited programs. And we find that this experiential learning is a great place for people to try out and to practice, engaging this way of being, as opposed to, okay, what do I do? What are the specific skills? But within those spaces, we're really trying to help leaders, as I said, embody this orientation, but then also learn, how do we facilitate? How do we increase this norm with the group as a whole? Again, we're in the very early stages of this. We're learning, but it's a really interesting, and I think a really important challenge of continuing this work and understanding the power of cultural humility in group spaces. So I'll leave it there. Happy to answer questions, but just a little snippet of some of the challenges and things that we're thinking about moving forward with cultural humility in groups.
Thanks, Martin. So Karen talked a little bit about some of the different settings that she's applying MCO. So that's one of the reasons we wanted to let her share is, Jesse mentioned one of the common questions that we got early on is, as people were beginning their training, they wanted to know how to integrate the values of MCO, not just into one-on-one counseling, but into some of the other roles that you would have as a psychologist. So I don't think there's anyone better to hear from than Karen on that issue.
Thanks, Donnie. So when Donnie, Josh, and Jesse first invited us to be a part of this webinar, we were in a certain place just in time and context. And over the past few weeks, I've been really reflecting a lot on sort of where MCO started and where we are now. And it's been quite a journey. And I've been thinking even in terms of just the years in which we started introducing this stuff to folks, not just in classrooms, but in schools and healthcare settings, and the sort of how people received it really shifted and has shifted me as a trainer. So I was thinking particularly like in 2020, like conversations around MCO became much more charged. Like organizations started asking me a lot more questions about sort of the framework and the language that I was using. And there started to become a few sort of policies and rules around certain words that we could use and couldn't use. And so then as an MCO oriented psychologist and teacher, I was just like, okay, so how am I using certain types of words? So I want to fast forward to 2025. And so teaching and training in Utah adds a whole nother layer to this. And so why I bring up context is because I see a lot of folks who are on our webinar today, and we're all kind of working from really different places. So really thinking a lot about our positionality geographically, sort of what the political climate is like, because it really shifts the way that folks receive and how we provide sort of language around cultural humility and MCO. Like for us in Utah, there's been a lot of recent legislation around DEI and debates about what can and cannot be discussed. And I often find myself really having to stretch the way I talk about the concepts that in 2011, when we were talking about this, I have had to expand my vocabulary a lot. Although the core concepts have remained the same, because we're an ever evolving sort of society, the way that we share it really shifts a lot. And so, what I have been sitting in is a lot of mixed feelings around cultural humility, to be honest. I have found myself wanting to stay in my little bubble around how I talk about it and with folks that share similar ideology and thinking. But then I realized like now is exactly the time when critical dialogue around this needs to happen. And I love my community of MCO researchers and providers because this is where I come back to fill my cup and then I go back out and I share it, with folks that may or may not agree with it. It's because we're living in a time, we're in intense polarization. And, I've been reading a lot of stuff outside of our field to really get a sense and take temperatures of like what people are saying and how they're sort of grappling with all of what's happening. And I'm just going to throw out a couple of names that folks may be familiar with, but Ezra Klein's been writing a lot about this. Ta-Nehisi Coates has been writing a lot about this, and they come from very different sort of vantage points. But what I love about the way in which they're engaging in this topic of polarization and multiculturalism is that they really embody cultural humility. And so I've been really taking some lessons from the way they've been writing with each other around the most recent sort of political event and tragedy. And I have been really trying to be more intentional in the spaces in which I enter and talk, whether it's a K to 12 like classroom or working with doctors and healthcare providers. But it starts with, for me, really noticing a lot of the physiological and emotional responses that we're having to the current political, whatever's going on around us, and really naming it. So then I'm going to just name another few of the sort of intentions that I've been sitting with. The other is practicing the idea of wondering instead of knowing, which is very much part of the cultural humility textbook that, this book is so like timely in that sense. And I just want to share one last thing in terms of normalizing discomfort as data. And this happened for me last week where I had a student, I don't know if folks read Isaac Prilatensky's work. I really love everything he writes, and I'm comfortable with his language because it really speaks to me. And for the first time ever in teaching, I had a student come in and she had Prilatensky's article that I had assigned. It was on mattering. And I thought, oh, everyone's going to love this. People are going to just like eat this stuff up. We're going to have this really rich and cozy discussion around mattering because why wouldn't we? And she came in And she had every line of that Prolotensky article highlighted with copious notes on the side. And she said, I am so sick of this ideology being shoved in my face. And I was a deer in headlights. And at that moment, I was just holding lots of feelings of discomfort, and others were as well. And I think it was probably one of the best discussions I've had, as uncomfortable as it was, because it really challenged me to practice what I preach around this stuff, and that conflict is really okay. Discomfort is normal. And as long as we hold on to the core tenets of cultural humility, which is curiosity, wondering, and openness, it's okay. We're going to get to a place of understanding, even though we disagree. So I'm going to stop my rant here, and I think open.
Karen, do you mind if I ask you one follow-up question? So in the moment that you had like the deer in the headlights, and then, you know, however many moments passed and then you responded, I mean, would you mind sharing? Are you comfortable sharing
Totally. Yeah.
what your thought process was? Yeah.
Because I mean, this literally happened last week, and I'm still processing just to be really, I've been thinking a lot about like running through the every single second of what had happened during that moment. I really moved through various stages. The first was definitely defensiveness. And I really wanted to exert sort of my authority as the instructor. And honestly, I really wanted to shut the conversation down because I was just not expecting it. So that came up first. And then next, I like put on therapist hat and I said, okay, how do we check in and process like what's going on in the room? Lots of people were shut down. Folks were trying to get a word in, but this student had, you know, a lot to share and wasn't allowing that to happen. And I started to kind of insert myself more as a process oriented. So I was thinking about Martin and, you know, the group setting. How do we help folks all sort of feel like they can contribute? And then at some point, I mean, I really just pulled on MCO and thought, okay, how do we sort of name this discomfort, normalize it? And one of the things that I work a lot with students on is, you know, conflict is okay. And I shared my defensiveness as well. I told the student, I feel pretty defensive right now. And I really want to sort of flee and avoid this conversation. And it took a lot of courage for you to bring this up because her perspective is for a very long time within our academic sort of environment was not okay. And so, and she belongs at the university. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question, Donnie, but I just moved through a lot of those emotions. And part of that was just sort of naming them out loud so to model for the students, like, I have no idea where we're going with this. But thank you for staying in the room.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Yeah, you definitely did answer my question. And I feel like in trying to apply some of this, just being able to talk to other people about how they handle those moments, you can read something on paper, but it's not the same as real life. And especially in the classroom, just to kind of what it feels like to me is I remember the first time I did couples counseling and I tried to do Carl Rogers style reflection and it didn't work because the other person didn't like me validating, the one partner's experience. And I didn't, kind of handle that in a way of being aware that there were at least two people in the room. Well, with topics that might have a lot of just reactivity and polarization around them, I've found that it's actually very challenging with the classroom where there's a lot of different people and people coming from different perspectives to handle that kind of space. And to be honest with you, I haven't seen a lot of people put words into even just how to think about what to do. So it kind of feels like you're making it up as you go for a while as a new instructor. And then you try to find people who can kind of help you start to orient. So anyway, that was kind of the reason I asked is like, I mean, I've been a professor for 15 years and it still feels like we have a lot to learn about what to do. And you have to do things very quickly. It's not like you have time to go back and do a Google search.
No, exactly. Because, we do those role plays with folks and simulations, and we just don't have that time. We have to respond in real time. And I was definitely building the plane as we were flying it. And I'm like, oh no, we're going to crash.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're gonna transition. So we have I think about 20 minutes left, and a number of people sent in questions. So I'm gonna kind of get us started with a few questions that were sent in, and we kind of I think what I'll do is just put the question into the discussion so y'all can kind of see what we're gonna address. And I assigned at least one person to kind of start with a response, and then if other people wanted to kind of chime in. So, I think what's nice about these kind of calls is we can just hear from a couple people, and we'll try to move through, as many questions as we can within the 20 minutes. So, Josh, one of the first questions, and I think I saw a couple of questions come through even in the Q&A. Someone was asking. What's it like? What are the challenges of being a white professor and trying to apply these ideas, and in particular, when you have students of color in the classroom?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Thanks for whoever sent that in. When I was reflecting on that question, I was remembering an experience I had early in my faculty career when I was teaching multicultural counseling. And I had gotten some feedback on, one of the student evaluations saying, I don't remember exactly, but something along the lines of, this class would have been better if it was taught by a person of color or a woman. And I remember kind of, at the time, I probably had some, feelings of inadequacy and, not being really sure of myself as an instructor, really not having my feet out from under me. So it was kind of tough to navigate that. I think there's a part of me that's thought, maybe they're right, and I kind of had to have that with an open hand a little bit. But for me, kind of two things came to mind when thinking about that question. One was just being honest about my limitations in regard to my own cultural perspective as a white person, and that that I was kind of brought up in a culture and brought up to see the world in a certain way, and that even though I try to really kind of check my biases and assumptions and try to learn as much as I can about different groups and their experiences, there's a limitation to that. I'm not going to truly understand, what it's like to be a person of color or a woman, or you can kind of go down the lines of the identities that I don't have, and that's a limitation. That's something that that's something that I don't have, and it's okay to be honest about that. And then the other thought I had, and maybe more of an encouragement, is I do think that everyone has a part to play in terms of helping student trainees become, culturally humble and develop their multicultural orientation. And I think everyone has a part to play in to make our society more peaceful, more just, more equitable. And we need everyone kind of doing that. It's not just for people of color. It's not, the burden isn't solely on people of color to help move us forward toward those goals. And so I do think as a white person, I have a responsibility and a part to play in that. So yeah, that's what came to mind to me. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's been my.
Thanks, Josh. Martin, you want to share anything? We've got a couple of white people that are on the call.
Yeah,
I'm happy to
no,
listen.
I have received very similar feedback as well. And I agree with the feedback. I do think there's an element of, the underlying assumption to the question, or some of these, some assumptions can be, as a white professor, my identity and positionality are not neutral. 100%, and that teaching students of color carries both historical and present day challenges. Again, in my eyes, 100%, and so for me, I really try to keep that front and present, right? Karen speaks of making the implicit explicit a lot within MCO, and I try to carry that with me a lot. So it's naming my positionality, acknowledging the limits of my perspective, because they are limited, particularly in that framing, and then creating space for students to bring in their own expertise and lived experiences, particularly students of color and students from other marginalized backgrounds. So just kind of adding to what Josh said, but I think it's a very fair question, and accepting it as truly, truly 100% legit is the first place to start in my eyes, because then I can acknowledge, hey, like there's reality here that needs to be addressed within this, context and relationships.
Yep. Yeah, I agree with all of that. The only thing I will add is what has been tough, and if I were going to give you kind of a book, Evelyn Hunter has a book on dealing with competency problems. To me, that's kind of where the rubber meets the road, is when you're in a position of authority and you really, if there's an ambiguous situation and there's a disagreement and a faculty member and a student have different perspectives of what's going on, in a certain way, a faculty member has power that their perspective may carry the day. And so it's a tricky problem of what to do about that. And I think her book does a really good job of framing what the issue is. In our program, honestly, what I feel like helped us the most in situations that were tricky like that is for us not to have anybody operating alone. So it's actually, it's kind of what you always hear with ethical situations. If you're in doubt, start to get feedback, get consultation, talk to other people. So really where our program had the biggest problems is if anyone got isolated. And so I actually think that would be true for me as a white person. I think I've also seen other people get kind of isolated in conflict. And so that would kind of be one thing I would recommend, is that people keep in mind, is that training is a collective process. It's not something you do one-on-one. So so y'all gave us some really tough questions. So I kind of front loaded the ones. This one, there were like probably 10 to 15 versions of people noticing that there are different rules related to diversity related topics. K through 12, there's quite a bit of legislation. There are new rules. Even in higher education, there are new rules. So I'm willing to say a couple of things about this, and I wanted to see if any other folks wanted to share something. It's actually really hard to know what to say when there are 50 states that potentially have different laws on the books. Every university, when there's a new law written and they have to figure out what it means, the university writes policy, and then there's an implementation of policy that might be, that it's not always clear how policy will get interpreted. So it's actually really kind of tricky to say one thing to a call this big. But I think the biggest thing that me and my colleagues have done is we have tried to just apply principles that we learn in ethics, and kind of learning about situations where you may have an ethical dilemma that may have, where what you are taught professionally may differ from what the law is, and how to kind of try to resolve any discrepancies. So I really think there's some wisdom to doing as much as you can to get knowledge of how your university policies are being applied. So one of the first things that we did was we invited our university attorney just to come and meet with us and talk with us and answer questions. And lawyers are trained differently, and they don't deal with hypotheticals. They're focused on the current law. They're not focused on what could happen in the future law. They're focused on applying the current law. So I would encourage people to just kind of have a humility about, just because you have high expertise as a psychologist, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to kind of navigate tricky issues legally. And to some extent, some of the things are legally in flux because there are changes happening. So I think the second thing I would say is we've been talking a lot about the benefits of having strong friendships where you can share about situations that you're not quite sure how to handle. There's something about being able to talk with other people that can reduce some of the stress and potential burnout that can happen when you're dealing with really scary situations. And so I think I would encourage everyone who's kind of feeling fear and anger and grief and all of the things that might be coming up during this time, not to get isolated and to kind of find other people where you can, start to voice some of those feelings and figure out what to do with them. Other than that, I'm actually not sure I would want to say a whole lot more, given how different the different situations might be, except to say I do think we need to keep talking about these things. It's really important to know what your rights are, and your rights are different depending on your role. So if your role is the dean of your college, you may have different rules than if you're doing a webinar as a professor. I mean, at Georgia State, as long as I say, I'm not speaking as a professor of Georgia State. I'm speaking as a citizen. I have quite a bit of freedom, as our policy currently reads. And there's a very clear statement of academic freedom by the Board of Regents in Georgia. And so I personally have decided to really lean into kind of reading the policies that kind of are currently governing things in the state of Georgia. But to be honest, it's still scary because I am in a state where they are negotiating those norms, and it's happening fairly quickly. So it definitely feels like a moving target. So I wanted to open it up if any other folks on the panel had other things you wanted to share about that.
Thanks, Tony. I'll just add in, from an educational standpoint, I think about these types of differences and value differences as moments of learning. I was just reflecting with a colleague of mine about the current case that's in front of the Supreme Court around conversion therapy, and it's a case out of Colorado, interestingly enough. And people are rightfully worried about where this ruling is going to go. And yet the process, if you listen to the Supreme Court questions, it's actually a step into humility and curiosity, right? So if we rule this way, how could this go? If it rules this way, how could this go? And I think engaging that dialogue is the essence of cultural humility, being curious about what we don't know and knowing that we're potentially passionate about stopping conversion therapy or not. So I'm not sure, depending on what side you're on, but just thinking that through instead of just jumping to like, oh, I can't believe they're doing this, but engaging in that process with students is the educational stance. Like, what else could this be? And are we actually entertaining we're like, there's another argument that it got all its way to the Supreme Court. So what is that argument? Are we willing to take the discomfort that it takes to lean into listening to that side of the argument if you don't believe in it and you don't agree with it? And so I think that's the hard part of cultural humility. It seems easy to be curious, but it's really hard to be curious when things aren't quite lining up your way. And I think that's the tough piece here. I would also say that it ties into, I'm not sure if y'all are reading this, but Jennifer's question about how do we live up to APA ethical standards when we live in states and laws when those two things don't align. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen because I mean, she's been living this in Utah for quite some time.
I don't think you want to ask me about how to keep things legal, but anyway, just just a joke, y'all. I do things, I'm a law-abiding citizen. But in any case, one of the things that I've been just sort of thinking about is, so I did a training recently, and sometimes when we are confronted with law and legislation that may not fit within our sort of ideology and values, we start to use the term like opposite, or people who are opposite from me, who are completely different from myself. And one of the sort of, I guess, exercises that I've been trying to work with just in terms of training and teaching, and even when I speak to a more diverse stakeholders, is how to find more of the points of connection. So when we think about things like really hot topics, for example, gender inclusion and gun laws and all of those sorts of things, we start to think in complete binaries, like we want completely different things. Like people who believe one way want one thing, people who believe the other thing, they're complete polar opposites. And so some of the stuff that I've been doing with students and in training is like, well, let's find the points in which we actually share the exact same value. So we both sort of believe in, like, I sat across from someone and who had one sort of stance on gun ownership, and I held a different side of things. And we had to come up with all of the ways in which we actually believe the same things and have the same exact values. And it was tough because we're so trained currently to only think in opposites. I know I'm kind of veering off here, but I think that is the part in which, when we sort of apply the idea of cultural humility, and Jesse, you spoke to this, in different sort of environments, is really finding those points of connection first, because once we sort of create those sort of empathy and connections, then we can hear each other a lot better.
Yeah, I left a couple notes, Karen. There's the scholar I actually connected with at Yale does interfaith work between Christians and Muslims, and that it's very similar. Actually, what he was looking to do is, instead of there being viewing another group as evil, which happens between societies that are either Christian or post-Christian and Muslim dominant countries, how there were actually a group of elite Muslim theologians that initiated we actually share a belief in the God of Abraham and a core ethical commitment that is enough for our societies to have quite a bit of common ground. And I don't, it was pretty cool. I really hope that it's actually possible to learn to do that, to kind of look for that space where you find true ground, to kind of have potential for there to be cooperation and friendship develop, instead of it kind of being an escalation of conflict that just goes kind of downhill. So I really hope that that's something that we can learn to do. So we have, man, it kind of feels like with the questions that we have, we could have probably gone for another hour, but we are going to end on time. I thought, just kind of as an ending question, I would let everyone on our panel just say, where do you see things going, either in the research that you're doing or in the application practically? Where do you hope that we'll go as MCO network folks? Jump in however you want.
Just a little bit of a plug. We just developed MCO training modules, 5 modules that goes over all main topics of MCO. You get a chance to listen from some MCO folks, as well as get some async material. Then the big magic is we do have some videos where people can practice and get AI generated feedback on how well they're doing. And so if you're interested in that, we're launching a study right now, and it's going to be more widely available afterwards. So if you're interested, let me know.
What about others?
I think for me, like, real quick, applying cultural humility and MCO to some of our most intractable problems in society and political discourse. Yeah, that's where I would love to see it go.
Martin or
Anyone
Karen,
else
do you have any
parting
thoughts?
thoughts?
Yeah.
No, I can feel the love in the webinar, and I just hope that folks realize that there are so many of us that are working so hard to create spaces that we can, disagree and still stay in the room together, and that's what gives me hope.
Yep.
Yeah, and I would just echo, reach out. This is such a collaborative, inclusive, group, and we need more and more people doing this work. And so thanks for being here, and don't be a stranger.
Yeah, and I think my main wish for us is that we, as a network, find more ways to kind of talk about what we're learning with each other. So, so I'll pass things back to Andrea. Thank you so much for having us and hosting us, and spotlighting our book. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you to all of you for the work that you put into this and the work that you put into the book, and for being here today and sharing your thoughts. I want to thank everyone who attended our session and participated in the conversation and asked such great questions. Please look for an email from us in the coming days with a link to the recording, complete with captions and chat transcript, and your attendance certificates will come in about a week. Please be patient with us on those. It is a manual process, but thank you to everyone participating in this webinar today, especially our wonderful panelists. We appreciate you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.